Hey everybody, how you guys doing? Hope you guys are doing good and bad, or else you're dead. Anyway, today we are going to do a lecture on the long discourses of the Buddha. Hopefully, and I'm going to try to say a little bit less. I have realized after watching my last two videos that hopefully by this point you have been looking at systems and philosophies of Indian thought and the Golden Age of India, and you have watched some of the material on the Dhammapada and the Buddha. So the long discourses of the Buddha are some of the more comprehensive philosophical texts of Buddhism. The original Theravada Buddhists and later Mahayana Buddhists, I do say Theravada and Mahayana, some say Theravada, Mahayana. The words would be more pronounced, and I think it would be better in English to say Theravada and Mahayana. And these are words that English-speaking folks don't say often, so there's no reason to start getting into saying Mahayana, even though that is the way that an English speaker might pronounce it. With some of these terms, Indian and Japanese terms, as not a language expert myself at all, I choose to put the emphasis on the third to last syllable. What's going on with Japanese and Indian dialects and languages is that English speakers and other Romantic language speakers sometimes put emphasis on the second to last syllable or fourth to last, second to last. And it's actually that in Japanese and in other languages, as in the Pali and Sanskrit terms that we're going to be learning for Buddhist philosophy, you would put equal emphasis on every syllable. So instead of saying Theravada, you would say Theravada. And so I put emphasis on the third to last because that sort of, instead of karate, it should be in Japanese karate. So you sort of third to last. It screws with the English and it makes it kind of reverse. So I do that as a technique. I don't claim to pronounce all these words accurately, but I do know Theravada and Mahayana are not the ways of pronouncing them. So, I mean, they are if that's the way the Brits pronounce them in British English. But we can say Theravada and Mahayana. I will consistently say Theravada for the original Buddhist orthodoxy, and that is what they call themselves, and that's what arose historically, whether or not that is exactly what happened, as best as we can tell. And Mahayana are the later second wave of Buddhism in India, and then we are familiar mostly, especially Americans and Europeans, are familiar with Buddhism in its second wave in China and Japan, and Zen, most specifically, especially after World War II, familiar with Japanese Buddhism and Zen, tend to look at Buddhism as Zen-like, when that's actually second wave Buddhism, and we will be talking about that. These long discourses of the Buddha are some of the first texts that are long, comprehensive philosophical debates that the Buddha is having with other philosophers and heads of other schools. They are extraordinary, and if you ever wanted good, solid proof that Indian philosophy is just as comprehensive and rational as Greek philosophy and Chinese philosophy altogether, which is a point I am very passionate about making, explaining the long discourses of the Buddha to people, which is what I am going to do in part. We're not going to explain each text in every part, but we are going to stick to we're going to go through some of the major long discourses. And in that, I said right there. I am trying. Yes. Impermanent efforts and all of these, that the Buddha's original teachings for the original Buddhist orthodoxy, the original Buddhist religion and philosophy that arose as orders of monks and nuns, however Buddha may have been or thought that should be, which is debatable, the original Theravada Buddhists believe that the Buddha's original teachings are collected in the Tripika. I'm going to try to say it's usually Tripitaka, but again, I'm going to be consistent here and be Tripitaka, the three baskets. Notice tri, like triceratops, tricycle, tree pitaka, that's the three baskets. So the three baskets of scrolls, like literal collections, they are literal collections, not just metaphorically and rather literal with the metaphor, that they are actual collections of texts in baskets and shelves and places. Like the Library of Alexandria wasn't a separate building, it was just shelves and shelves and shelves in a temple of all the scrolls ever, and people went looking for the Library of Alexandria, and it turns out it wasn't a building like a library. Similarly, these are three baskets of text that turned into shelves and shelves of scrolls and texts for later Buddhists. The Pali Suttas, many may know the word sutra. Sutra is in Sanskrit and other dialects what a text or a sacred text or any text is. In Pali, which is what North Indian, Nepalese, all of that area, which is now different and different nationalities, would call it a sutta, not a sutra. Like they say Dhamma rather than Dharma, very similar. Many people are familiar with the Sanskrit Dharma. In Pali, the original Buddhist languages of the original Buddhist text, it would be Dhamma, like Sanskrit but slightly different. Notice the R's become M's for Pali. And actually, I have a friend who went to Germany to study Pali and get a PhD. And the only reason you would study Pali is to understand early Buddhism, because I'm pretty sure nobody speaks Pali today, but you could read it, and you would read it in order to understand early Buddhism, possibly some Jainism, and because that also arose in what is North India. I have to say, with a smile on my face, a long time ago on my website, somebody, and I lovingly have recounted this story, somebody commented on a video, and it's still up there on YouTube, that I did about the Buddha, and I said he was from North India, and someone commented and say, "You are not a wise man. The Buddha is not from India, he is from Nepal, but keep on going, you can do it," and told me that without any punctuation. So that is very encouraging. And again, I feel both insulted and encouraged at the same time, but that's awesome because I think the person was trying to be encouraging, and much love and happiness, on possibly from Nepal. And yeah, the Buddha's Nepalese, he's North Indian. That is all, of course, not exactly. There's many kingdoms and an empire that comes along with Ashoka, much like Alexander. Ashoka's grandpa, which we'll talk about, is the unifier of India, and then the one who tries to bring Buddhism or the overall culture sort of to everybody as like, now this is what we're doing. We'll talk about the ins and outs of that with Buddhism in India, which is a later lecture. So the Pali Suttas, the original Buddhist texts, are oral traditions which were memorized texts. Monks would chant these, and they wouldn't have texts at first. Then monasteries, like Christian monasteries, became centers of writing, literacy, school, translation. A lot of times the religion would be the only literate place, including the nobles would not be literate, would have priests be the scholar, literate people for them. This is something that happens in many cultures with religion. So religion is the university system. If you were a woman or a man in a bad circumstance in life, you could run away and become a monk or a nun, and that wasn't everything anybody might perfectly want, but meant there was some mobility. You could get out of your life and go be literate, like running off to another state and going to college or something like that, without a dime in your pocket, is kind of what that would be. So there, again, in ancient societies, there is some mobility, and in our society, there is some mobility, and some worry that is diminishing, so we can see all of this as human beings and human movements. So these texts were written down on palm leaves sometime between 500 and 100 BCE. So sometime about 500 to 100 years before Jesus, which is right in the glory days of Aristotle and Plato, who were around 300-ish, between 400 300-ish BCE, that as this was going on, the Buddha had already been around the time of Mahavira, around 600, 500. Mahavira is somewhere around 600, Buddha is somewhere around 500 BCE. The texts, much like the Gospels, are written down and then become their finalized versions after Jesus was dead and past, and is possibly metaphysically elsewhere, along with the Buddha in the Pure Lands. I'm not a religious person, but there are many who think Buddha and Jesus are somewhere, and that's perfectly fine. I'm not there knowing that. That's around this time, the Buddhist texts are being written down hundreds of years after the Buddha and or Jesus is dead. So this brings the debates, of course. Did Buddha or Jesus ever say these things? And we always have to shrug a tiny little bit and say, well, we're not perfectly sure. But this is how the tradition remembered them and how it was cooked down into texts and remembered. And these were oral traditions and stories of Jesus and Buddha that then became gospels and central texts, religious texts, the suttas and or, for in Sanskrit, sutras, the sacred texts. The three baskets are the three categories of texts The Vinaya Pitaka, the rules for life in monasteries, the Sutta Pitaka, the Buddha's philosophical lectures, and the Abhidharma, it's Abhidharma in Sanskrit, Abhidharma, analysis and interpretation. Something like there is, I'm blanking, the Torah, and then there is the Ahadith. The Ahadith is Islam. There are texts, and then there are texts of commentary about the text. That is academia, and that's academia and literacy stretching back for thousands of years. As soon as we have texts, we have often texts about the texts and commentary on the texts, and that's what religious people were doing in marginalia and in side commentaries. Much of the great philosophy of the world has been done for thousands of years as philosophical and religious commentaries on central religious texts. Regardless of what you think about religion, I happen to be somebody who thinks that religion should be seen as human, and then you and I are welcome to be as religious as you like, and that is something I highly encourage. Not to be religious, but to be free to explore religiosity or not, and see that as human history. And I'm a non-religious person myself, so I'm really not plugging a particular lifestyle or angle. But because we now have a vista in human history where we can see the world's major religious traditions and cultures, it is very true that we can step back and say, well, the world's cultures have been human, and a lot of the world's philosophy has been done as philosophical commentaries on religious texts, regardless of what you think about religion, which has supported people and also held people back like laws and rights and like societies do today. But we do these things differently, of course, but we are also human and share, I would say, general human culture in the ways that these work. Again, I do say the word general human culture. I'm not sure if that's a completely anthropologically acceptable term, but I mean just overall the generalities without it being categorical or without without exception or counterexample. Yes, commentaries on the things. So you have these traditions of the Buddha. They are baskets of texts, and much of the Buddha's core philosophical teachings are found in the long discourses of the second basket, the Digha Nikaya, consisting of 34 discourses, 34 philosophical debates. The first and second, along with several others, are the most popular, and they have several key points and metaphors that are used by Buddhists and many Buddhist schools for thousands of years. When you get to Zen, Zen is a very favorite of mine. I do enjoy Zen as a system of thought and its whole history. I got to grad school at a time when I could study the whole history of Buddhism and Zen more so than folks had on an elementary kind of, grad but elementary English level, which we only are starting to have now because people have funded Greek philosophy. They have not been funding Indian philosophy or trying to make America understand Buddhism much. I don't mean they and evil they. I mean, it's just not our culture. As a Bay Area Californian, I dove head first into Buddhism thinking, hey, may as well get all into its history without much reservation, as not a Buddhist nor a religious person. And Zen is fascinating, and if you want to understand Zen and the history of Buddhism, understanding the early Buddhist texts and also understanding the Zen people are not going to mention the Buddhist text to you because they're going to figure you've already gone to their college. They're going to figure you already have read the stuff, and they're going to use the metaphors in strange, tricky ways on you, like the lion's roar is going to mean all kinds of things. There's a lion's roar in these texts, and it is the Buddha saying truth, and when you say truth, it kind of punches through the ignorance, and everybody's like, whoa, that's wise. That's the lion's roar of truth. Zen people use the lion's roar of truth all the time. You can hear it's used in kung fu moves and things where they're like talking about the lion's roar or other things. That is like a kia, like in karate, hit the mic there with a kia. That is very much associated in Buddhism and kung fu, identified gong fu with Buddhism, and Shaolin, which was a Taoist monastery turned Buddhist monastery, as the lion's roar, as like a kia, and like that, like chopping through boards of wood and that sort of Karate Kid kind of thing. I grew up in the 80s. And yeah, that is very much in this text. And so when later Zen people are saying lion's roar, it's good to know early Buddhism, even though many Americans find Zen more entertaining and Buddhist, interestingly, which is me too. I like Zen a lot. So in these early Buddhist texts, this is, and I have had many students say, this is not exactly the Buddhism that I'm familiar with. The Buddha's talking in interesting ways about God and gods. and talking like they may be real or something, and that's not the Buddhism I understand. Well, this is very early Buddhism, and the Buddha's considering all sorts of philosophical opinions, and he's really talking at length. These are the long discourses of the Buddha. One of the things that's very Zen is Buddha and others just sort of sit there silently. The Buddha sat silently, as mentioned with the Dhammapada, until he got up and started running around and talking and debating to everybody until he died. Towards his death, he meditated more quietly and said that he was meditating quietly in order to face death. But that is at the height of his popularity, when he is already popular towards the ending years of his life, when he has already acquired a following and people are imitating him quietly meditating. And people have wondered, is Buddhism, even, and Zen people talk about this all the time, is Buddhism about quiet meditation? It's a nice tool. That's not what the central point of Buddhism is to quietly meditate. It's not to anger everyone in argument, which is what we will more do today with the Buddha. I will turn off the clicky noise on the phone. Yeah, there we go. All right. That is not what Buddha is normally associated with, like me talking a mile a minute at everyone, but that is what the Buddha did a lot because he is one of the world's most famous philosophers. So these texts are very early Indian Buddhism. They are not very Zen entirely. The Buddha is talking to a lot of people and debating a lot of positions. I have had more than one student say, this is not really what I thought I was signing up for. But when we get to Zen, which is a lot of times more Americans and Californians like myself understanding of what Buddhism is, I sometimes call it naive hippie Buddhism. And I don't mean that in a bad way. I don't consider myself a hippie, but I was raised by folks who were somewhat hippie-ish, not total hippies, but were of the culture somewhat, and that was popular. It was the style at the time, like Grandpa Simpson says, of the onion on the belt. So I call it naive hippie Buddhism in a loving way because it's not poor. It is more that the Buddha said chill out, which is awesome and is true, and then not really having read through these texts. Having read through these texts, I was frustrated because I was thinking, well, this isn't exactly what I understand of Buddhism, but the odd thing is, do the Zen people or the original Buddhists understand Buddhism entirely? And you and I are understanding it as we go through it, and the Buddha would say something to that effect. Not that he knows Buddhism or Zen people know Buddhism, but probably that there is and isn't understandings always, because he is a consummate relativist, as we will see a lot in these texts. So let's get to these texts. I do not pronounce these words often, so I'm going to try to slow down and pronounce these words well. I do not, as one would assume, even though I love these things, I don't speak these words back and forth to people in conversation, so I have to kind of finagle and ease my way through the term every time. And my apologies for being a native English speaker and mangling all the foreigner words. So, the Brahmajala Sutta, the Supreme Net text, Sutra, the Supreme Net Sutra, is the first of these and a very popular long discourse of the Buddha. So a lot of these discourses begin with the words, "Thus I have heard," describing an oral tradition of witness passed down. So the text begins, "Thus I have heard," and notice, in fact, the Nyaya Indian logicians say testimony is one source of evidence. That's just as true as it was then, and then there's other things like that, perception and testimony, and those are two of the four kinds of evidence. Buddhists are talking to them, and when they say, "Thus I have heard," it's very much like the Gospels, and people will say, oh, science and religion are completely different. This is very true. You will find religious folks pointing to evidence all the time. In fact, miracles, whatever you think of miracles, they are a weird kind of evidence that people would point to and say, see, that person did that. Clearly they have these powers. So in a certain sense, people are seeking evidence, and you and I can question whether, in these texts, the Buddha shoots up into the sky at one point after saying he does not need to do miracles. We'll talk about that a little bit at length. So people are saying, "Thus I have heard," as I'm offering witness testimony. I was there. I heard the Buddha say this. This is true. Because, of course, at the time, you would have to have people orally saying, well, this story is true, this story is true, and then they write it down. "Thus I have heard." This is witness testimony in a court of law. I have heard, King, that the Buddha himself did say one day, and this is like the Gospels and many texts talk about in the world's traditions. It is purposefully saying, I am a human witness to what has been heard, and then those words itself become the sacred text, even though the text says these are mere human words, which is another interesting back and forth one finds. The texts themselves become somewhat deified and somewhat sacred, even though the texts themselves say these are mere human words. Because, of course, we're all in the spirit. We are all in the mind state. So it is also the pure, supreme truth. So thus I have heard, describing the oral tradition of witness passed down, says the Buddha was traveling with 500 monks from town to town, and also followed by Suppiya, a teacher who criticizes the Buddha, and Brahmajala, Suppiya's student, who praises the Buddha. These are supposedly an older Hindu and a younger Hindu. They are following the Buddha. Think about how this is physically true. The Buddha's wandering around India. He is debating with people, and an older Hindu is following him around who doesn't like Buddha, and a younger Hindu is following Buddha around. These are actually proto-Hindus. They're not technically Hindus yet, but we can treat them as such. But technically, Hinduism is arising and codifying at this time. So there's sort of proto-Hindus, like there's proto-Jains and proto-early Buddhists, people who were yet to become Hindus, Jains, and Buddhists. And there's a more general Hindu guy who is saying, I don't like this new philosophy. And there's a younger guy who's like, this is cool, this is hip, this is where it's happening. Well, that would be culture and counterculture, the younger and the older. And the younger is saying, I dig Buddhism, it's the new thing. Now, what kind of propaganda is that? Well, that would be a text arguing for a certain sort of position, and it would be presenting Buddhism as the successor to Hinduism and the way of things. Also figure by this time, this text is written down when Hinduism was a thing. So I'm describing what may have happened in people's words at the time. At this time, in the text, this is a Hindu Brahmin, a younger Hindu Brahmin, top caste, philosophy, priest, people, the people allowed to do intellect and intelligence. We have a warrior's son who is second caste, who is saying, I'm a Hindu Brahmin-ish guy because I'm going to be a philosopher and a sage, and I've been out in the jungle enough, I don't have to listen to the Brahmins in the main culture. So the older top caste Brahmin is saying, I don't like this guy. The younger guy is like, I like this guy. And they're debating while following the Buddha. Now that's a very nice metaphor, isn't it? Like, we have a new philosophy that's up and coming. We have an older guy who's the establishment. I've heard Bill O'Reilly refer to the establishment after the hippies as a positive thing. I haven't heard much from him lately. That there is the establishment, and then there's a younger questioning that. Well, that's new, isn't it? You know, that's culture for thousands of years. So that's awareness of that, and they are debating about how this is the Buddha is this new amazing thing. The positive and negative opinions about Buddhism are quite literally personified following the Buddha, which is a nice teachable metaphor that's trying to explain to people why they should be Buddhist. So all of these people, the Buddha, the 500, and the 2, stop for a night at a park with shade and water provided by royalty and guarded with a wall for travelers to rest. This is a public park, and at a time when a lot of people would be pilgrims and evangelists with different things, different systems of thought, they would crash up in a public park where people could sleep, and royal patrons and others would put on debates of philosophy and fun public parks, because just like today, slapping your name on something makes you popular and helps flex your power, get involved with the state, all of that. Public works, being privately funded, all of that, of course, is, back and forth. Why there is a park here and why they are staying in the park for a night. There's a lot of Buddhism that happens, and a lot of Greek philosophy that happens in these sorts of public places that are either the public sacred grove of something or the park where people are. They're public places which are also privately supported, with the whole mixture of that back and forth. So they are in this park. And in the morning, the followers of the Buddha were talking about how wonderful it is for the Buddha to be aware that there's an older guy who doesn't like him, there's a younger guy who does like him, and the Buddha's aware of all this, and the Buddha doesn't say, hey, knock it off, you're right, you're wrong. He just allows this to follow him. He does not say, you, stop. He just allows the older and the younger to follow him, and he does not try to steer their conversation one way or the other. He can just quietly maintain, and he knows they're debating it, but he just lets it happen. He doesn't have to force things. Of course, this is a very powerful text arguing that this is the way to be, while it is saying the Buddha does not care really about forcing people to be a certain way. So I don't mean that that's perfectly hypocritical. I mean that that is clearly what's going on. This is a very powerful, persuasive text because it's convincing us the Buddha does not need to deal with jerks. He can just let them do what they're doing, and it's like, yeah, that's fine. So the Buddha hears his monks, his followers. They weren't probably canonized monks just yet. Maybe they were. It's hard to know if they were official monks with specific robes at the time. It's presented as they were. Could be 500 people just kind of hanging out. The Buddha hears these guys and says that they should not, probably as much, there were women as well as men there. That's not recorded like that, but probably. And says that they should not be angry with anyone who criticizes him, his teachings, or them, his followers, as this will hold them back and prevent them from seeing if the criticism is right or wrong. That's wonderful advice today. Of course, I'm decently left-wing. I have always believed in looking over right-wing stuff because I do kind of not only want to strengthen myself, but also if there are real legitimate criticisms of the left wing or of one's position, you should go looking through the opponent's thought in order to understand your own position and your own weak points. That is a very strong and powerful position. Wisdom is somewhat general, not that there is simple universal wisdom that has 14 points, but it is a very wise point and a very good deep point of human wisdom to say that you should love your enemy, but also listen to your enemy, because what is your enemy going to tell you that isn't just something helpful and strategy for you? If you aren't afraid of being right and wrong, which the Buddha is presented as being I'm right, I'm wrong, it's fine, then what is your enemy going to say? They're going to tell you how you're wrong. Yeah. That's all they're going to do. That's exactly what the Buddha is saying. Yeah, there's right and wrong to everything. Relativism. Not everything is equally right and wrong. There's right and wrong to everything. Much like Confucius says, perfection is nowhere, but goodness is everywhere, always at hand. Was joking in the last lecture for the Greek class. You need a lock, you need a lockpick. Serial killers are great at picking locks. I'd keep them firmly under control if you're going to be using them like that, and I would question that, but there's good something in everything terrible. Perfection is nowhere, like the Greek utopia, a pun on nowhere. Here again, the Buddha does not need a perfect world or everybody to agree with him. He says all of this is fine. Don't be angry with it. You can use good and bad talk as good and bad talk. That is very much a Buddhist answer, that anything good and bad is just what it is, and it is good and bad in the ways that it is. And the world continues and the cycles of things do continue. Sometimes, of course, for some that isn't hardlining enough, isn't taking enough of a stand. This is also very much in the more skeptical wisdom, as opposed to more so, I would say, more dogmatic, like we need to take the side. While the Buddha is presenting Buddhism and himself as reaching a very supreme truth, and is unquestionably doing that in a most dogmatic way, at the same time as maintaining the real truth is you look on all sides of things, you see the good, you see the bad, you see the right, you see the wrong, and when people criticize you, that is fine. You do not need to. You can do something. If people start kicking children and criticizing people, now you can do something, but you do not need to do anything if people are doing bad, but the bad is not burning anything down and you can learn from it. Probably we should not do anything as horrifying as the Tuskegee study or experiments on prisoners of war to make things screw up. These are utilitarian ethical issues. You don't want to do wrong in order to eventually get right, like experiment on animals in horrible ways necessarily, but human beings debate and make judgment calls about these things. And so yes, pragmatism is sometimes not, I do identify the Buddha with skepticism and pragmatism a lot. I don't think anybody is perfectly skeptical or dogmatic, but there is, a la the Hegelese, there is very skepticism and pragmatism to the Buddha, many have recognized, and the relativism is see the good in the bad and the bad in the good, much like Archilochos, the ancient Greek poet, was discussing in the lecture for the Buddhist philosophy class. I do feel that is a powerful piece of advice. As much as there are times to jump up and do something, there's a lot of times to just see the good and the bad and the good, and then the point is to do what you can rather than what you can't. The Buddha says that only foolish worldly people praise him, say the Buddha's cool, for abandoning violence, sex, lies, videotapes, entertainment, luxury, property, and servants, slaves, for doing the right thing and saying the right thing at the right time and to the right extent. He's basically saying all the cool stuff about me, anybody who praises that is an idiot. And like he's mentioned pretty much anything he could be cool at. Like, because he left home, he left being a king, he left having slaves and servants, he left all of that stuff. And he's like, anybody who thinks that's cool, fool. Only foolish worldly people criticize his opponents. Now, this is funny. The Buddha's saying only, he's actually saying here, and again, how much is this a comedian? He's basically saying only foolish people praise how cool I am, and only foolish people praise how stupid my opponents are. Now, that's funny because, of course, he's not saying, and they only criticize me for being fool. He is actually saying, I'm awesome, they're stupid, and and of course, think about the indirect, to be critical here. It's kind of awesome. This is maybe the Buddha's words, maybe this is the way it was cooked down, maybe he said more, maybe he said less. But the Buddha's actually saying here in this canonical Buddhist text, only idiots praise Buddhism for being right and me for being right. And only idiots bash Hinduism and effectively Hinduism and Jainism in their proto-states for being wrong, wrongity, wrong. And they screw up all the time, and you can see it in life. Yeah, only idiots would criticize that. So, of course, the Buddha's saying I'm awesome. You know what I mean? He's saying Buddhism's right, which of course he is. He is also saying it's right in seeing the rights and the wrongs. He is saying, but we're more wise and relativist than them, which is why we can see the right in their wrongs and the wrongs in their rights. My favorite Chinese philosopher, Shuang-Tzu, who would be blended specifically with Buddhism to make Zen, says if you want to see the rights and wrongs and rights and be truly wise, the best thing is clarity. And the Zen would be like, and that clarity, they would just identify it with Buddhist enlightenment and say those are the same thing. And that's a little bit of a problem back and forth, because it's sort of yes, plenty. Technically, there are different terms for different, in different cultures and philosophies. But yes, effectively, clarity is something like enlightenment. Those were very identified in Zen between Taoism, native to China, and Indian foreign Buddhism. I love that bit, because the Buddha is praising himself and criticizing his opponents, saying only an idiot would do what I'm doing right now. I do think that a lot of this does come off as joke, and it comes off like Socrates and Jesus, a lot of it, which I'm not necessarily saying there is a class of person who is wise, is correct, and that is Socrates, Jesus, and Buddha. But Socrates, Jesus, and Buddha talk as if they're sarcastic and that they're sort of is this thing on? Tap, tap, tap. It's that, my microphone is down here and invisible. Yes, the choir, etc. That this is kind of a stand-up comedy routine, and is that showing wisdom? When Jesus is jokey, and many of the parables of Jesus, I have a good book I have not read yet about how the parables of Jesus present God as everything awful. Like, he's like, oh, God's kind of a jerk who's forgetful, who owns a vineyard. It's like, what the heck is that? That's stupid. And like a lot of Jesus's metaphors are like challenging people to like look at God as some kind of jerk. And it's like, but that's not the way you would sell anybody on anything. So is that a routine? It seems like it's sort of wise. It's like, no, I can see the good as some kind of bad idiot because that's everything in a Zen-like way. Well, obviously that's my interpretation somewhat. That is what I'm picking up from the at least back cover and first pages of this book I need to read. The Buddha is, in this bit right here, is this a lack of self-awareness? Is this the Buddha didn't talk that way, but his followers clearly canonized the text and wrote it down in this way, selling Buddhism to people? Because they're going to. As their religion and practice, they're promoting their monasteries. They're promoting their practices through the neighborhoods and being like, we are where you want to come if you want to shave your head and learn to read and become a better person. So if they are doing that, they're definitely saying they're right. Is this the Buddha? And I like to say, like Socrates and Jesus, saying, oh, I'm an idiot. I don't know anything. Hey, I'm doing the bad and the good. He might be so meta and aware here. He says, the Buddha keeps going, there are other things that are hard to see and beyond ordinary thought that the wise can know that do deserve praise. Neither discipline nor reason can reveal these things. The particular knowledge that these practices reveal leads to further birth and death. Things coming, things going, more of the same, up and down. But being unattached to this itself is to know true peace and freedom. Each time, Buddha says here, and this is where he says God in the text, and people will say, so the Buddha is a monotheist, a polytheist? The Buddha is probably talking here as if there is gods like a proto-Hindu, and that's who he was. He was something like a proto-Hindu in an area where Jainism had been taking off, who now is going to be the Buddha, the original Buddhist. So he is talking like there's gods, and then he later is asked, and in a text he says there are and aren't gods, there is and isn't truth. So he is very much looking at things as metaphorical, and the Indian ancient people knew what metaphors were, specifically talked about them as figures of speech. We're not just blind to metaphors. We use metaphors blindly all the time. They did, and then say these are metaphors you cannot take as literally true. And shamans and illiterate people were probably that intelligent, and we just don't have it written down because they didn't write. So here the Buddha knows kind of meta that he is saying things that are somewhat human and proud and stupid. He also seems to know that yes, this is all metaphor. So he says, and this is why, again, because Buddhism is sometimes called atheist and agnostic, and it is probably sort of true to say Buddhism kind of has as many gods in a culture as it needs to, and then is somewhat agnostic beyond that about the whole, because of this kind of gods are, but they are metaphorically. That's very much like if I said the theories of science and gravity are real, but they're kind of human words for things, and we may understand them as Zerblat differently, but the soul spirit of it, the overall reality is real. But I'm using the word gravity in our understanding now for something that Einstein himself had problems with Newton's gravity. We didn't go so much with Einstein and throw that word out. We kept with Newton, some say. So in a certain sense, gravity's real-ish. So that would probably, when the Buddha says God here, I'm not arguing he is or isn't monotheistic. I am saying, like many people, he would say, well, the world's kind of monotheistic or something, and then he is talking like that and believes he can and is trying to do that and say that's the way you should talk. That is confusing to people, and again, sometimes people get to this point, they're like, I'm pretty sure Buddhism isn't monotheistic. And it's like, yeah, no, probably not, but this sounds it. Buddha says each time the world is reborn, God, Brahma, becomes lonely. The universe itself becomes lonely as an anthropomorphic being and creates the other gods and beings. Later, and remember, what is born often dies in these traditions, so that would mean the gods possibly are mortal or immortal or something. Later, those who seek wisdom beyond the home, this would be wisdom beyond the home, seeking something beyond the home is classic Buddhist language for going to a monastery or get thee to a nunnery, and you would be going to be philosophical and being Buddhist, which of course they're praising like heck as the thing to do. They discover that things are impermanent, pleasure is addictive, and logical reasoning gives stability to the ideas of the mind. Notice, logical reasoning gives stability to ideas of the mind. The Buddha believes in doing philosophy and believes philosophy leads to less attachment by engaging with thought, but also disengaging from thought, both. Very much as a relativistic balance. The Buddha very much believes in talking and thinking. He also believes in freeing your mind, shutting up, and emptying your mind also. Both. So if people are like, wow, the Buddha's talking a lot and saying logical reasoning, I don't know if that's Buddhist. That would be very basic human confusions. People believe in arguing and shutting up both. And the Buddha's trying to balance them out. And I don't know if cultures believe in one rather than the other, if that's Western science that believes in talking rather than listening. I would honestly say, if somebody says science talks more than it listens, I would not even know if that person knows what they're talking about. But no matter what career they have. But that is my opinions. And again, I don't have every career, thankfully. I don't have the time. So the universe becomes lonely and it creates itself again. This is kind of like Mayan Big Crunch, Big Bang. It's like in 2012 or 20, if the universe for the Mayans ends, it's going to be reborn and reflower outward. As far as I know from physicists now are somewhat questioning if it was a Big Bang out of nothing, but at the same time, if it was, then it could be Big Crunch, Big Bang again, and I don't know what the current thinking is on that, nor do I know if we know that we know what the current thinking is going to be on that. But yes. So, those who seek wisdom beyond the home find out that things are impermanent, logic stabilizes the mind, and they split into those who believe that the self and world are permanent and those who do not, which are called in the text, which is trying to forge words of English to match what the text is saying, eternalists and non-eternalists, which could also be said the infantists and the finitists. Now, I'm into the back and forth of dogmatism and skepticism, that there is objective or subjective truth. Oftentimes, if you believe that there is something objective, you mean that it is, and this is a very wonderful place where in early Indian thought, we find something like subjective and objective being very specifically debated. In India, Greece, and China, you have to backform the words subjective and objective into things, but when we are talking about something like communal and permanent, fixed, such that it is universal, it is unchanging in all times and places, that would be objectivity and the big stability, and the communal and the collective. If you say something subjective, you mean something partial and something temporary, something mortal. A perfect God would be an unchanging, fixed, non-birthed, non-dying thing. You also have in the Indian and Egyptian text, it kind of gives birth to itself outside of time continuously. So it's sort of always being born and dying, but it's just permanently fixed as that. You then have temporary mortal creatures down here who are temporary, who are somewhat real for some of the time to some extent, and that is the subjective and the objective. Now, when people talk about scientific objectivity, I am somebody who says human truth is pragmatic and human, not that you should not trust the sciences and vaccines, but that human beings have been gathering evidence and trying to think with the brains we have the whole time. We have all the evidence in Greece, but also in India and in China, especially, as well as elsewhere, in tribal societies, that people try to gather evidence and argue for it. This is very human. This is not something Western. It's not something scientific. It's not something white to argue about things or to use logic. This is a serious mistake to think that some cultures are logical and others aren't. That needs a lot. That in the 70s was kind of declared to not really be true. And we just sort of talk like the Greeks in science and or white people just do debate or talk or logic. Whenever you find comprehensive human texts and things, people are into debate, they're into argument. That doesn't mean they contradict all authority everywhere, but they like to argue. They are very argumentative. It's hard to get out. Watch. The video just went out.